Hi everyone, it's Katie and I'm here today with a bit of a indirectly requested video. Basically, I'm apparently known for managing to find some really great out of print, sometimes hard to find decks. And so the question often comes up, sometimes on Instagram, sometimes via email, sometimes on YouTube: how are you finding these decks? How is it that you have managed to get your hands on some really awesome out of print, hard to find decks? What is it that you're doing? So I thought I'd just make a bit of a video, just kind of going through a few of the things that I do that have successfully found me some decks that I was really pining after that were out of print. I've had some people say that I must be rolling in cash because of the sort of out of print decks that I've managed to get my hands on. And one, that just isn't true. And even if it were, I'm not the sort of person that would just spend top dollar on something when I knew I could get it for a more reasonable price. But having said that, I think we need to be careful of judging people who do spend a lot of money on decks. Some people are collectors, some people are really interested in the history of tarot, whatever it may be. Some people do spend a lot of money on tarot, and that's okay. But for me, I don't have access to that kind of money, and even if I did, I don't think I'd be spending all of that money on tarot. I have a certain budget and I work within that budget. And so these are just some tips about how to find decks that you really want that are out of print, hard to find, without going too crazy on the bank account. Before we even get into the meat of this video, I just want to bust one really big myth, and that is Amazon is absolutely not the best indicator for market value of tarot decks, especially those that are out of print, especially those that were perhaps limited edition or independently published and have been out of print for a long time. You will often see those prices listed on Amazon are very inflated, like ridiculously obscene. And so I think people often, they see out of print decks on Instagram or YouTube and they do a quick search, Amazon comes up and the deck is $600. And they assume that the person they saw posting spent that much on the deck. And that is absolutely not the case. I can guarantee you I've never spent that much on one of the decks on Amazon. And I can pretty confidently say that most people you see wouldn't have spent that much money on the decks. But when you see a really high price on Amazon, it's usually because of the condition that a 50-year-old deck is in, or that it was a certain number, limited number, or it might have been the first edition. Whatever it is, it's also convenience. If people have the cash to splash and they want that deck now and they want a certain edition and they want the book included and the box, that's when you're spending that sort of money. So the tips that I'm going to share with you might not be the sort of tips that you want to hear. They're not particularly exciting. I don't have some secret website that all of the tarot collectors sell their decks on for $10. It's just not a thing. And if it is, someone please let me know. 90% of finding decks, in my experience, has been patience. So I will share with you some tips, but like I said, they're not glamorous, they're not exciting, they're just really simple, but for me they've been effective. My first tip is to write a list. Make a list of all of the decks that you would absolutely love to own. This includes in-print decks, but is I think especially useful for out-of-print decks and hard to find decks and rare decks and vintage decks and all of that. Write a list. You can make it as extensive as you want, it doesn't matter. Write that list and enjoy the process of writing that list. But then once you're done, just kind of remove yourself from any attachment you have to those decks. And be totally okay with the fact that you might have to wait a year, 2 years, 10 years, 20 years for that deck. Just be totally okay with that. And be okay with the fact that you might never get that deck. It's kind of manifesting 101, but I think it also is just really practical. To have a list really keeps you on track, it keeps you focused, and it saves time. A lot of these tips are just about being smart with your search functions, and having a list enables you to be specific when you're searching. And it also means that you're not just trolling through pages and pages and pages of eBay going, that deck looks pretty, that one looks interesting, that's a bargain. All of that stuff can be fun every now and then, but it also takes up a lot of time, especially if you're doing it regularly. And it can also be quite costly. So tip 1, compile that dream list of tarot decks, and then just kind of set it aside and accept that those decks will come to you if and when they're ready to. Tip 2 is to be search savvy. Educate yourself about how the eBay search function works. It's not complicated, you don't have to spend weeks learning. Just learn a little bit about Boolean searches, for example. Learn about how to optimize your search terms. On eBay you can set up alerts for when a certain item is listed that matches your search terms. So if a deck is quite rare and only comes up on eBay every now and then, you can set up in your account to be notified if an item listed matches those search criteria. Do your typically specific searches, like if you're looking for the Fantastic Menagerie Tarot by Bobba Studios, search for the Fantastic Menagerie Tarot by Bobba Studios, but also be conscious of trying out much more vague terms. Now this can take a little bit longer, but if you're clever about it, it doesn't have to. This is especially useful for very old decks. Search for very vague terms like vintage tarot deck or vintage cards. Like, you can get as vague as you want, but basically the idea is you have to kind of get into the mind of someone listing something on eBay. And for some people, yes, they're collectors who have a few decks that they want to move on, and they'll be very thorough listing out all the details of that deck. Another person listing on eBay might have just inherited a bunch of boxes of stuff from their nana, and there's a couple of bags, just like pouches with tarot decks in them. They don't have their boxes anymore, they don't have their little white books anymore. So this person doesn't know anything about tarot, has no idea what this deck is called, has no idea when it was published. Those are the sort of opportunities that kind of pop up every now and then, where someone doesn't really understand what they have, they pop it up on eBay. That's when you can get yourself really good bargains, especially for older decks. So do your specific searches, be clever about your searches, set up the alerts, and occasionally try those more vague terms as well. Another tip is to just keep your eye out. I know that sounds really silly, but I've found plenty of out-of-print decks just in small metaphysical bookshops. The most recent example would be the Art Nouveau Tarot. I found this a couple of weeks ago at Back to Basics in Williamstown, and it was $30, just like a regular deck is. I don't think this is the sort of deck that goes for a ridiculous price, but it is out of print. At Back to Basics there was also the Margaret Peterson in English, which I know goes for quite a bit of money. It was $35. I'm not super into the Margaret Peterson, so I didn't buy it. But there was several out of print decks there, and basically what happens, especially with the smaller independent sort of store, is, you know, they just have stock in the back corner and they bring it out one day, and, you know, it's new stock, but it's just from a few years ago. So that can happen. So don't just assume that you will never find an out of print deck at your local shop. The same thing goes for op shops or thrift shops. The next tip is really just to check in with yourself as to why you want that deck. Now this isn't, you know, some fluffy kind of idea of whether you really need it or not. That's not what this point is about. What I'm getting at is, why are you wanting an out-of-print deck? Is it the collector value? If that is the case, then this next part won't be for you. If it's not the collector value, if it's literally because you like the deck, you want the deck, you want to work with it, you want to play with it, you want to learn from it, which is very much the case for me, then you might want to do a little bit of research about that deck and take a few things into account. I might use my Royal Fez as a good example of this. The Royal Fez Moroccan can go for a lot of money. And when I first fell in love with the Royal Fez, that was really intimidating. But I quickly learned that there were actually two kind of separate editions. The first was in the 50s and it was a limited edition. The second was in the 70s and it was just printed by US Games, I think. So it's still out of print. But obviously those two distinct editions have very different values. All of these things might sound really simple, especially if, you know, you're not interested in the collective value. They're kind of inconsequential. But all of these things really add to that price or reduce the price. So that's where it can become helpful to be a little bit savvy about the decks that you are interested in. So with the Royal Fez, for example, I was very aware that I wasn't looking for the 1950s edition, I was looking for the 1970s one. A couple of other things to consider is kind of like where you sit with the condition you would like your cards to be in, and also whether you would like any accessories that were originally sold with the deck. So for example, my Royal Fez I think is fine. This is completely fine for me. It's used. There's a couple of marks, pen marks on the cards, a couple of the cards. It did smell a bit like smoke when I first got it, but I just put it in a box with some baking soda for a few weeks and that sorted that out. I'm not too fussy with the condition of my cards. It's just something that doesn't particularly bother me. That obviously means that I have access to a much cheaper and a much wider variety of decks. Another thing to consider is if there were any accessories sold originally, whether you want those or not. One can simply be the box that it came in. I have at least 4 or 5 of the out of print, rare, hard to find decks that I own didn't come with the boxes because that doesn't matter to me. And as soon as you don't have the box, that dramatically decreases the collectible value. So if that's something you don't really care about, be open to finding one without a box because that will reduce the cost quite a bit. Some decks were also sold with books, so if that's something that's really important to you, expect to pay quite a bit more. Especially the older things get, the less likely it is that those two, the deck and the book, have stayed together. So that can start to get really quite expensive. So if you're not too fussed on owning the book, that can help you find a cheaper option too. So if you're not too fussed on finding that mint condition, original first printing deck, and you instead kind of shift your search to, you know, those loved later printings without original packaging decks, you are much more likely to find one at a really reasonable value. Just for an example, you've seen how much this thing can go on for Amazon. I'm sure the cheapest I've ever seen it on Amazon for was $300. It's often up there for $600 or more. I paid $60. Now that is still quite a bit of money for a deck, but that was a price that I was completely happy to pay. And the reason I got it for such a good price is because it came without the box. It was the 1970s edition. There was a few marks on the cards, all of that stuff. The next tip isn't particularly glamorous either, but I think it can be really useful. A lot of decks might be out of print in English, but they may still be in print in other languages, such as German or Spanish. Alternatively, they might be out of print entirely, but you may be able to get the different language deck a lot cheaper. The decks that are coming to mind would be the Mythic, the original Mythic Tarot, which is a deck that a lot of people really love and really want. I've seen it really quite cheap in German, and you could just purchase that and work with the deck without the book. But if you really want the book that accompanies the new Mythic Tarot is the same. So if you chose to purchase the German edition of the deck and then go and purchase a second-hand copy of a book that is still in print, that might be a really affordable way for you to get your hands on the Mythic Tarot. Another one that is a really sought-after deck is the Fairy Tale Tarot by Lisa Hunt. This is a tip I gave Elise a little while ago, and I know it worked for her. You can get the Spanish edition of that deck really easily. I don't know whether it's still in print or whether it's just not as sought after because it's Spanish and not English, but it is widely available and really quite cheap to purchase. And then if you are really keen to get your hands on the book, because I think that's the sort of deck you would really want to use the book with, you can purchase the Fool's Dog app, which has the entire book on the app for a few dollars. So just have a bit of a research, especially if the deck hasn't been out of print too long, like if it went out of print in the 90s or something. Have a bit of a look into whether it was printed in different languages, because that might be a way for you to find it more affordably. Another example of when it's really good to kind of look into alternatives is when the deck might have been curated from a certain art type or from a certain artist. A good example would be the Fantastic Menagerie is based on the artwork of J.J. Granville. And I did a video about this recently where I was really pining after the Victorian Flowers Oracle by Bubba Studios based on the artwork of J.J. Granville, just so I could match an oracle deck with my fabulous Fantastic Menagerie. But again, that's an out of print deck and it's quite hard to find, and I'm okay with waiting for that one if and when it comes to me. But the artwork of J.J. Granville is in the public domain, and there's another deck, the Isidore Tarot, which is, I think it's on Etsy. It's based on the same artwork. It has a different feel and whatnot, but it might be worth looking into that. For example, if you're really looking for the Fantastic Menagerie, it might be worth looking at other decks based on this artwork, such as the Isidore Tarot. Similarly, with the Victorian Flowers Oracle, I found the Floret Oracle, which I've done a bit of a video on, which, you know, isn't the big fancy cardstock and the big cards and the book and everything that comes with the Victorian Flowers Oracle, but it is exactly the same artwork, and it's exactly the same concept of the name of the flower with a few keywords. And this was $30. So I think sometimes it's easy to be wooed by the allure of an out of print, hard to find deck, and I completely get that. It's really exciting to find an out of print deck that you didn't think you'd have. But equally, if you can find something that you would enjoy just as much or nearly just as much, but you can get it for $20 or $30 or whatever, it might be worth considering. For me, I am so happy that I picked this up, because I just adore it. It's everything that I wanted from the Victorian Flowers Oracle, except I didn't have to stress out about looking on eBay all the time or saving up for it. You know, this is a really great example of finding an alternative. And at the end of the day, you might decide that no, it's that one that you really want, but I would invite you to at least explore the options. My next tip is just to participate in your communities, online or in person. There's so many Facebook groups now for trading tarot cards or selling tarot cards. I would suggest find the ones in your local area. Like there's one or two Australian specific ones that I'm a part of, but also keep your eye on the more broad groups as well. Tarot Swap is probably the most popular one that I know of. And although a lot of people will prefer to trade within their own country, sometimes when decks are worth the postage, people will be willing to trade or sell outside of their country. Eclectic Tarot is fabulous as a resource in general, but if you pay to subscribe to Eclectic Tarot, it's not very much. I think it's $10 for 3 months or $25 for a year. Like, it's really reasonable, and you're supporting the whole forum, which is an otherwise free service. You then get access to the trading forum, which literally is people offering up decks for sale or trade, and it's really quite active. I guess I've already spoken about it, but trading, you know, if you don't have $100 to purchase this deck that you're desperate for, either that's not the right deck for you, or you might want to consider offering a trade. A lot of people really enjoy trading. I know I do. And a lot of people are really open to trading, even if they haven't explicitly said it. It's not, as long as you do it politely and with good intentions, it's always worth an ask. Trading is actually how I got my Fantastic Menagerie. This is another deck that goes for well into the hundreds of dollars. Mine was sealed. Mine was brand new. It didn't come with the book that you can get, but I'm totally okay with that. I never thought I would have this deck at all. But a trade came up, and even though I had to trade multiple decks for this one, in the end, the two of us agreed on something that we were both happy with, and I didn't have to spend $1 basically, and I just moved on some decks that I wasn't using. Trades are wonderful, and without trading, I wouldn't have this deck is in my top 4 favorite decks, and it would have been completely inaccessible to me had I not been open to trading with someone. Okay, so I'm thinking I might write a blog post to kind of compile everything I've said into a little bit more of a structured presentation. So I'll leave a link to that below if you feel like you could use a little bit more clearly expressed tips. You can find that on my blog. But if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to ask me. I'm sharing this because I appreciate that I have been lucky in finding some decks, but I think it's also just being a little bit clever and a little bit patient. And you know, if you have fallen in love with a deck that you think could really enrich your practice, be willing to wait, be patient, but don't give up on the idea of owning it. So I hope this has been helpful. The link to the blog will be in the description box below. Ask me any questions, leave any comments, and I will get back to you. And until next time, guys, much love. Bye.